Hello, everyone. My name is Chris Haney. I'm the Executive Director of the California Budget and Policy Center. We're an organization based in Sacramento, but operating statewide that seeks to improve the lives of Californians through improved budget and fiscal policy analysis, particularly for low-income households and for communities of color. And it's my pleasure to be with you here today as part of this annual conference. We have been a presentation and programming partner to Southern California grantmakers over the last several years, and we are honored to be able to do that once again. Here today with my presentation, you'll also be hearing later in the conference from one of my colleagues, and we hope you'll consider us a resource as you think about your own work on state budget and policy issues. My pronouns are he, him, his. Today I'm wearing a white dress shirt. I'm a white male with curly hair. I have a set of noise canceling headphones on. I have a backdrop on the screen, which is a California poppy field. That's part of my organization's backdrops we've been using in this COVID-19 environment. So I'm here to talk to you today about the California budget and the proposal for the next fiscal year, which is for 2021 and 2022, starting July 1st. We usually talk about this process as a process that starts in January with the governor's initial proposal. Deliberations then happen over the course of the next few months. The governor makes a new proposal or a revised proposal in May, and then the governor and state legislators hammer out a deal over the next few weeks that gets resolved in early to mid-June so we can start the budget on July 1st. That's the usual process, but nothing this last year, it seems, is usual. And so there are some wrinkles or some changes to all of that that are affecting what's happening this year. So I want to back up and start from a place of saying just how much conditions have been changing and have been variable in ways that have made it hard or harder than normal to budget. So if we think back more than a year ago to January 2020, and this is going to be on the next slide, and just think about the state's revenue outlook. I need to go to the next slide. There we go. So if we think about the revenue outlook for the state, back in January of 2020, Governor Newsom proposed a general fund budget for the state of $154 billion. And then COVID-19 happened, and the governor's May proposal in 2020 revised that budget proposal from $154 billion down to $100 billion, a loss of $54 billion that was projected because of the economic effects of COVID-19. And in June, state leaders hammered out a deal with the governor that actually increased that budget to $134 billion through a series of maneuvers using the state's reserve funds, calling on some revenues temporarily, and some other budgetary maneuvers that I won't go into the details here, but it allowed the budget to be bigger than $100 billion, $134 billion in total, but had a set of trigger cuts, more than $14 billion that would be taking effect on October 1st of last year if the federal government didn't provide funding to make up the gap, which it didn't by October 1st. So some of those trigger cuts started. But by January of 2021, because economic conditions did far better than state leaders had anticipated, states' revenues were coming in at a much faster clip than we had expected. And Governor Newsom then basically submitted a proposal in January that had a spending plan or a general fund budget of $168 billion, including a $15 billion surplus of funds we hadn't anticipated. So if you think back across all of that, we had this $154 billion budget in January. we thought a whole bunch of things were going to change, and we put a set of actions in place to try to address those changes. But the underlying conditions that drive the state budget didn't change very much, in fact. And so we ended up with a January proposal last year that was 154 billion. We now have a January proposal from this year that's 168, almost as if COVID-19 didn't happen. And yet we know COVID-19 happened, and we know there are really significant spending and investment needs that the state has. And so I'm going to walk through some of what's going to be happening next in terms of the state budget and some of the things that have already happened. So let's go on to the next slide. So the other variable in all of this that I want to talk about is, before we jump into some of those early actions, is that the federal government has taken its own action to be helpful to state governments, to local governments, and to help the people who've been harmed by COVID-19. So the American Rescue Plan that President Biden and Congress agreed to a few weeks ago will bring 26 billion of that will come directly in direct aid to the state of California. The state can use that to cover COVID-19 related costs, to offset any revenue losses, which in this case the state didn't have, as I just outlined, or for infrastructure, for broadband infrastructure, and for clean water and sewer projects. $15 billion will be coming into California cities and counties. For counties, that's based on the share of the US population. For cities, it's based on a formula for population and poverty that's a part of the federal Community Development Block Grant program. And the states are expected to provide funds to smaller cities that don't typically fall within that formula. And the use of those funds is the same as for the state: COVID-19, revenue losses, and for infrastructure. And then there's a whole host of additional funds for healthcare, education, cash assistance for individuals with low incomes, childcare, food assistance, rental assistance, homelessness, and small business. So a huge plan and a huge injection of funds into the state. And so those things, the revenue the state's taking in on its own, and then the funding that's coming in from the federal government, set a very different context for how state leaders are budgeting as they go into this year. It provides, fortunately, a lot of resources that they have at their disposal, but resources that will be at their disposal largely for sort of one-time and shorter term uses, because these federal funds won't be around for years and years. They have to be used in many cases over the next couple of years, or next 3 or 4 years in some cases. And the federal dollars won't be there long term, and we don't know for sure that the state's revenues will be there either. So state leaders are largely thinking about these as temporary funds that they can allocate to address the public health and economic effects of COVID-19. So let's talk about what state leaders have then done, because I said at the beginning that usually the way this works is that the state would have this normal process from January to June of enacting a state budget. But because of COVID-19, Governor Newsom and state leaders have already agreed to a set of packages that have put some aspects of what they would have normally enacted in June in place early. So there's a set of early emergency actions. And the first of those was enacted back in January. It was an emergency budget bill. It was passed just a couple of weeks after the governor submitted his proposal. And this emergency budget bill addressed housing needs. Specifically, it extended the state's eviction moratorium, which had been in place for the last 9 months or so before that. It extended that eviction moratorium through June of 2021, so through the end of this coming June. And it provided, using federal funds, rental assistance to low income and some middle income renters to help cover their back rent or the owed rent that they have. So extended the eviction moratorium, provided some rental assistance for tenants through April 2020, and that uses about $2.6 billion in federal funds. So that bill was already enacted and is in place. And that's a piece that doesn't need to happen as part of the rest of the budget process unless they want to decide to further extend the eviction moratorium. So go to the next slide. So there's another emergency action package that was enacted in early March. This one had more of a big press release with it and became known as the Golden State Stimulus Package. That's the framing the governor put around it. This package provided a one-time $600 tax refund for those who qualify for the state's earned income tax credit in the 2020 tax year. So for people who are filing their taxes in 2021 for last year, if they qualified for the earned income tax credit, they receive a $600 additional cash benefit. If those households are undocumented immigrants, or as the technical term is that they have a federal identification number other than a social security card called an ITIN number, for those folks, they receive an additional $600 or $1,200. They're eligible for the state's earned income tax credit for tax year 2020. And the other stipulation there is that the income eligibility for undocumented immigrants goes up to $75,000 in income. The rest of the population, the income level is about $30,000 with the earned income tax credit right now. And the reason for that change is that state leaders were trying to cover the gap in federal assistance that had been provided through the federal relief packages, which excludes undocumented immigrants, but provided cash up to the $75,000 levels to other low-income households. So the state was trying to say, look, they didn't receive the federal dollars. We're going to try to step in and fill that gap. There's a couple of other provisions. There's an additional $600 for people who are eligible for CalWORKs, the state's welfare to work program, and an additional $600 to people who receive SSI, SSP, which is the federal and state program for providing cash assistance to low-income seniors and people with disabilities. So if you're eligible for the other programs, you also get another $600. And there will be some folks who qualify for all of these things, and so they'll get $600 in additional cash assistance in multiple ways. And then lastly, the Golden State Stimulus Package also included $2 billion for small businesses, nonprofits, and cultural institutions through a state grant program. This is a program the state put in place last year, and they added a significant amount, an additional $2 billion in additional grants that they'll be giving out this year as part of the Golden State Stimulus Package. So that piece is also already done, and that piece in and of itself won't need to be enacted as part of the budget. I would note, however, that when the governor signed the Golden State Stimulus Package into law, he did indicate that there may be a need for another relief package or stimulus package like this that could be coming by June, and that could be moving separate from the normal budget process as well. And so that's something we're also watching for right now. And in the meantime, the American Rescue Plan was enacted, and so those dollars are now available for the state to use. So we are anticipating that there will be some additional action either as part of the budget process or maybe separate as some sort of stimulus or relief effort. And we'll go to the next slide. So the rest of the budget is still in play, and there are proposals that are still being negotiated between the governor and state leaders. So everything I will present for the next few minutes, remember, is in proposal form. It is not yet a done deal. And let's start with public health, because what the state spends on public health in the middle of a pandemic obviously is the first priority. So Governor Newsom is proposing to spend $820 million for testing, surveillance, and response and prevention. There's also $300 million for distribution of the vaccine and a public awareness campaign. Now, one of the things that isn't clear is I think a fair bit of that money is actually coming from the federal government. That may not all be state funds. but that's what the governor has in his proposal. In each of these areas, I'm going to outline where there are some key gaps or where the debate is with the legislature. And so one key gap is that the governor's proposal did not include ongoing funding for local public health departments, which is a significant concern in the middle of a pandemic where local public health agencies are the first responders and are, in many respects, also key actors in the distribution of the vaccine. So that's an area in terms of ongoing funding for local public health that they're continuing to debate. And we'll go to the next slide. Let's go to the safety net, the programs the state has for helping low-income Californians, where there are a few proposals. In the food assistance arena, there's $11 million in one-time funds for the California Food Assistance Program. This is a program that provides food assistance for some qualified immigrants. It has a lot of restrictions on it, so it doesn't serve as many immigrants as we would hope, and particularly leaves out undocumented immigrants in most instances. But it is a state program that sits next to the federal food assistance program we call SNAP or CalFresh in California to try to help fill some gaps. And so the state's putting dollars there. There's $40 million or about that much, 17.5 for one-time funding for a senior nutrition program and 22 million ongoing. And then there's $30 million in one-time funding for food banks. And I see that there's a question in the chat about the food banks, about will any nonprofit organization that is providing food assistance be eligible to apply for these funds? And I have to admit, I don't know the answer to that question, but it's one I can follow up offline. And I'll put my email up at the end, and we can make sure that we sort out that question. In the CalWorks program, our Welfare to Work program for the state, there are also some additional expenditures proposed, $46 million in one-time funding that would extend the monthly benefits that CalWorks recipients receive from 48 months to 60 months. The state has a plan in place to move permanently to the 60 months model, but not until 2022 and thereafter. The state cut back to 48 months during the Great Recession. And one of the things state leaders want to do is make sure that people in the meantime, between now and 2022, don't get kicked off of the system after 48 months. And so they're providing some funding to temporarily bridge the gap to 2022. There's also $50 million ongoing for a 1.5% increase in the monthly grant that people receive. So not a huge increase, but we went years both during and after the Great Recession where there weren't grant increases in CalWorks. And so this is I think the third year in a row that there's been an annual grant increase put in place. So that's also a good sign. There are some pretty big gaps in this arena. The most significant of those is that there is no expansion of childcare assistance. And we know that the state is probably losing anywhere from 30 to 50% of its childcare providers who haven't been able to make ends meet or haven't been able to put the kinds of facilities and COVID-19 practices into place in order to be able to operate. And so we're going to need to prop that system up, provide aid to providers, and make sure that childcare is available to people who want to re-enter the workforce as COVID-19 dissipates. And so this is a big gap. I think that you'll probably see addressed in the governor's May proposal, and is definitely a priority for the legislature. There's also no grant increase for low-income seniors and people with disabilities. And this is an area that continually over the last decade or so doesn't get addressed in terms of providing a grant increase. And as a result, the grants don't keep up with costs of living, and it makes it harder for folks who receive that assistance to make ends meet. So that's also a gap that will be a part of the ongoing negotiations. And we'll go to the next slide. In the housing and homelessness arena, there are some significant new investments 500 in housing, 500 million one time for infill infrastructure grants that the state provides, another 500 million in the low income housing tax credit, which is a tax credit that supports the development of affordable housing. In the homelessness arena, there's about $1 billion, 750 million for one-time property acquisition through the state's Home Key project. This is what was the Room Key project, attempting to provide temporary rooms to homeless people by acquiring property like vacant buildings and vacant hotels and that sort of thing. It's now been called the Project Home Key project because they're now trying to turn those temporary facilities into permanent homes for people. So there's 750 million there. There's also 250 million one time for acquisition of facilities that will help take care of low-income seniors. That's a part of the budget. The key gap in this arena is that all of the funding is one time. There's no ongoing funding to combat homelessness. COVID-19 set in, it's going to be a crisis for sure coming out of this whenever we get through it. And so there's going to be a significant push by state leaders, particularly folks in the state legislature, to call for some ongoing funding in that arena. And we'll go to the next slide. The K through 12 arena actually receives a lot of new funding. Those of you who know how this works, we have a formula that is in the state's constitution that provides a minimum level of funding for K through 12 schools and community colleges. And when the state's revenues go up, that formula determines that they automatically get a share to meet that minimum guarantee. And so because the state's revenues are doing really well, there's significant new funding in the K through 12 school system. So there's about 15 billion more for the next fiscal year than the state had planned for in the current fiscal year. This was an area where the trigger cuts I had mentioned earlier in the presentation that would have started in October were a significant issue, where there were going to be a bunch of deferred payments to schools as part of those trigger cuts. The governor's proposal would actually repay a fair bit of those deferred payments, making up that space, and then also provide a supplemental payment of $2.3 billion in order to try to make up some of those deferrals from earlier. Because of all of this and the way the constitutional formula works, there would also be a $3 billion deposit into a separate reserve fund for K through 12 that's also in the state constitution. So that just would happen by formula. There are a couple of key issues here to deal with. One is that there are a lot of folks who think that the $2.3 billion supplemental payment isn't necessary because K through 12 funding is already going up considerably relative to other parts of the budget. And then the American Rescue Plan itself brings another $15 billion into K through 12 schools separate from the funding that comes to state and local governments that I described earlier. So there's a lot of funding flowing into K through 12. And that supplemental payment then is one that people start to think of as maybe being unnecessary. And we'll go to the next slide. There are also some budget proposals for small business and workforce and higher education investments. So there's almost $800 million in one-time tax credits and grant and loan programs through the state. And there's some support specifically for entrepreneurs. A key issue here that we're concerned about is that several of the tax credits that are used aren't necessarily well targeted to small businesses or what we think of as small businesses. Some of these tax credit programs actually result in a fair bit of the credits going to larger businesses. So that's an issue that's going to be negotiated and talked about as part of the budget proposal. In the higher education arena, there's some new funding, $350 million for one-time program or for one-time for programs that link higher education to employers, for new apprenticeship programs, and for investments in science and technology, math types of programs. So That's all one-time funding, additional, that's actually being designed to kind of approach coming out of the economic effects of COVID-19 and hopefully provide some new workforce development kinds of opportunities. Key issue here, like I've said in some of the other areas, is that it's one-time funding. It's not ongoing. And although the higher education institutions are receiving some funding from the American Rescue Plan, there's not a significant amount of new ongoing funding that's being proposed in that arena as well. And so we'll go to the next slide. So I've walked through a lot of what's in the proposals overall. So here's what we're watching for as we look forward to the next few weeks and the next couple of months. So the governor's May revision under state law has to be released by May 14th. So we're just a few weeks away from the governor's second bite at the apple. And some of the questions we'll be talking about are, are some of these gaps and issues that I've raised and that the legislature is raising, are they addressed in the governor's new version of the budget put forward? A second question is, will the governor, as part of the May revision, propose how he wants to spend the discretionary federal dollars that are coming in from the American Rescue Plan? And there's going to be a lot of questions about those funds and how they might be used to combat the effects of COVID-19. So that's an area we're watching. There's a third issue that I haven't said anything about yet. That's a kind of a complication in the budget process, which is going back to 1979, the state of California, because of an initiative that voters approved, has a spending limit, something that's called the GAN spending limit after the gentleman that put the measure on the ballot. And this spending limit is not is structured so it leaves the state some flexibility in most situations. And so we haven't had to deal with this issue very often over the years. But when our revenues grow significantly more than we anticipate, like what we've been experiencing for the last year, we can bump up against the limit. And when we bump up against the limit, it then restricts what we can do with the funding and where it can go. So this GAN spending limit became an issue as we realized the state's revenues were coming in. It looks like, because there are some provisions in the way that the law is written, it looks like it may be able to be addressed fairly easily this year. There's an emergency provision that basically says if the state's facing a major emergency, the money it spends on the emergency doesn't count toward the limit. We're obviously in an emergency with COVID-19, and so a lot of the spending that's being proposed or already enacted will count as COVID-19 related spending and therefore won't count against the limit. But that's an issue that we'll have to address both in this year's budget and likely in some budgets going forward. And then I think a question on a lot of people's mind is, how does the recall that seems likely affect the governor's proposals? Does it make him more ambitious in some instances, or does it make him more cautious and reserved in other instances? Lastly, the governor signaled, as I said earlier, the possibility of a Golden State stimulus package, a second one of these, either pre or post budget deals. So that's something we're watching out for, and it directly interacts with how the governor might use the discretionary federal funds. And lastly, the state leaders will then strike a deal on the budget, probably in early June. That's how it's worked in the last few years. So that means from May 14th, when the governor's second proposal will come out, that there's just about 2 weeks or 2.5 weeks before a final deal will get struck on the budget. So that's the process. I do want to say, going to the next slide, that I ran through a lot of the dollar amounts and a lot of the technical aspects here, but I want to remind everybody that what we do with the state's budget is a statement of our state's values and priorities. The budget itself is a policy process. It's a bill. It's the most important policy process and the most important bill that state leaders get to enact each year, because it takes the enormous wealth of the state and allocates it to places. And we want to make sure it looks like what we want it to look like, that it invests in the California that we all want to live in. So want to stop there and say that I'm very happy to take some questions. The next slide has my email address and phone number. And for those questions I'm not able to answer here, I'm certainly happy to address those questions with you offline, get the help with some of the members of my team, and hopefully we can be helpful. So you can feel free to contact me on that information on the next slide or on this slide. So thanks, everyone. I will stop there and take some questions that'll be forwarded through on the chat. I appreciate the time and you're letting me walk you through the big process and the big set of proposals that are always what the state budget looks like this time of year. Yeah, I see that in the chat that someone has said that many affordable housing organizations have been providing food assistance to residents and could benefit if eligible. Yeah, absolutely. I think the federal funding that's come through, there's certainly the housing help local governments that provide housing, but it's also designed to help provide aid to nonprofit organizations and community-based organizations that have been helping people access rental assistance, access counseling services, and access the various ways that individuals are eligible for the federal assistance. So those funds are intended to be used that way. The specifics of how they will be allocated, at least from the state side of things, I think are still one of the areas that the details are getting sorted out. And that's something that actually worth knowing about all of those federal funds that are come through. In some instances, they come through with very clear paths because they're programs and services the federal government has used many times over the years. And so how the dollars flow is clearly laid out in the American Rescue Plan. But there are also places where the dollars being provided are being given with some flexibility for the state to determine how they are given out, or some of the dollars to local governments are given with some flexibility. And so some of the details of then how those dollars are prioritized, where they flow to, are still in question. And those are a place that we all have an opportunity to have an impact in terms of guiding our state and local leaders as to where we think those funds should be allocated, who can deliver the services, making sure that the funds get to the neighborhoods and the communities where they're most needed. And we have a question about how the delayed tax filing deadline affects the budget adoption and the final budget numbers. And it's a great question, actually. And it will have an impact. If you think back to my first slide about all the revenue projections, how we went from a really big budget to a small budget and then all of a sudden back up to a big budget again. Some of the challenge in all of that was we didn't know where the revenues were going to get hit because of COVID-19, or whether maybe they wouldn't get hit very much. One of the things that the delay of the tax deadline at the federal level from April 15th to May 17th, and the same deadline now applies in California, one of the effects of that is that the state's revenue collections, which it normally learns a great deal about for the next year because it collects taxes in April, aren't going to be known as well to the governor and to other state leaders when the May revise comes out. And the space from May 17th to when they have to strike a deal on the budget is very constrained. And so it's not clear how much they will really know about the revenue picture for the next year based on the tax deadline having been extended. So it does increase the likelihood that there's going to be some significant variation from what budget they actually enact to what really happens in terms of the revenue collections. If conditions hold, it will likely mean that revenues are significantly higher than what they budget because they'll be cautious. They won't want to budget for more revenue than could be there. And so what will happen is they'll probably underestimate how much revenue is there, and then there'll be a so-called surplus somewhere down the road. Yeah, there's a question that says, that I mentioned that the state budget does not propose to expand childcare. How will the federal funding in this area impact that? Great question. Yes, the federal dollars will significantly impact what the state now does in the child care arena. So there is about $4 billion in federal aid that will come in to the state's child care programs. Less than half of that, I think it's around 1.7 billion, will come in through the federal block grant program that provides grants to providers. But there's another 2.2 or 2.3 billion that actually comes into the state government with the flexibility for the state to determine how the funds flow to providers and childcare centers through a grant program the state has to set up. And so that's a place where there's significant attention to the fact that there are going to be new details needed to figure out how those funds flow. So I think one way or another, whether the state puts more money in or not, you're going to see the governor's May revision have a lot more on childcare just because of the federal funds. There's still a need for the state to put in ongoing money. So it's important to remember that the money from the federal government for the state to deal with the fact that we've lost so many childcare providers and childcare centers, we're going to have to start building out an infrastructure that both provides funding for the facilities and provides aid to the providers, and also ensures that these are decent jobs. So we have underpaid childcare providers for way, way, way too long. And if we're going to attract skilled people back in to be childcare providers in a larger, hopefully larger infrastructure of childcare, we're going to need to make sure those are good jobs. And so all of those things are going to require money, and they're going to require more than one-time funding. And so the state's going to need to figure out how to use the federal dollars to lay a foundation for a much larger, hopefully more equitable childcare system that addresses the fact that many low-income communities have struggled for years to find access to affordable childcare. So thank you for that question. We got another question that asks if I'm able to share if the state's budget around wildfire preparedness and whether there will be funds allocated to nonprofits that support wildfire response. I don't know the answer to this question. I do know that there's significant new funding that state leaders are proposing in the wildfire preparedness and response arena. What I don't know is to what extent that flows out in a way that it affects nonprofits. I haven't looked at the details of all of that. So that's something we can follow up on offline. It's not my organization's area of specialty, but we just try to track the funding. So I know there's new funding, but I don't know exactly how it's being allocated. I apologize for not being able to answer that one. And we don't have any other questions at the moment. But I did want to say that if there's a major theme to all of this, and that hopefully I can leave you with, it's you've heard me say it a number of times. It's been in a number of the responses to questions. There's a tension in the budget conversations that's happening going forward. That's about the issue of one-time funding and the issue of ongoing funding. So we're in this period of relative largesse where a lot of unanticipated revenue is coming in, a lot of federal revenue is coming in. And so that creates a tendency for state leaders to think everything is okay. But we know COVID-19 has created a whole set of needs. It has destabilized a large number of low-income households in the state, particularly households in communities of color. And those were often households that were struggling to make ends meet in California before COVID-19. Things have now been made less stable or more vulnerable in many instances. And there's going to need to be significant investments in those communities as we come out of the pandemic eventually. And so there's a need for ongoing funding. So the state's going to need, beyond the one-time funding, the state's going to have to figure out how it makes some investments in some infrastructure that makes sure that the folks who were vulnerable to COVID-19 because of their economic circumstances aren't vulnerable to the next economic downturn or the next public health crisis. And that's going to take some different thinking and some different structure. The childcare conversation that I just shared with you all is exactly that kind of restructuring effort where we had an inadequate system beforehand that left huge deserts in terms of affordable childcare for communities that needed it. We have to do better than that if we're going to be an economically viable state that's equitable. And so that's going to take a big new infrastructure. It's going to take ongoing funding. It's great to have the one-time funding because we can start to lay the groundwork for that ongoing work. But we're going to need to combine the two things. The sweet spot here is the combination of using the one-time funding to do good things that set you up to make the ongoing investments so that the state's a more viable place to live, particularly for those folks who have been harmed by the pandemic and who were at risk beforehand. So thank you, everyone, for listening, for your questions. Please follow up with me if you have our analysis of the governor's May revision, probably by May 17th. So watch for that on our website. We have an analysis of the American Rescue Plan that is also up on our website. And we'll be covering other aspects of the budget as we go through the process between now and June. So thanks everyone for your time and for being here today. Thanks to Southern California grantmakers for this great event and to my colleagues who are doing the interpretation and the captioning and making this accessible. Thanks for all your work. Have a great day.